There are several ways in which you can change your spectrum calibration or spectrum referencing. Which method you want to use will depend very much on the circumstances as to why you need to change your spectrum referencing, but also on your own personal preference. So you can see here I've got two spectra which don't correctly overlay. One is this purple spectrum, which is correctly referenced, and one is the blue one, for which we need to change the referencing. So one method is to double click on that spectrum in the sidebar. This brings up the spectrum properties, and then we can go to dimensions. And if you scroll down, then you can see these parameters here, referencing ppm and referencing points. Essentially what these specify is that at point 1025, the ppm value should be 8.991. So obviously I can easily change this, but it may be slightly difficult to know by how much you need to change this. So unless you have a particular value that you know this should be, that might not be your best method to use. Sometimes the way in which you record your spectrum may mean that you know that the referencing point needs to change, and so you might want to change that value. Obviously, if you do that, then you'd click OK. In this instance, we're just going to cancel. So an alternative method for adjusting the calibration of the blue spectrum to align with the purple one is to select two peaks in one in each of the two spectra. If I now right click on one of these peaks, I can go to Calibrate Spectra from Peaks. This brings up a new dialog box, and you can see at the top we get this fixed peak. So by default this is the peak from which I selected the option, but if you wanted to use a different peak you could choose that from the drop down menu. This basically specifies which of these two peaks will stay in the same position, and then any other peaks that have been selected can be moved to align exactly on top of that peak. So you can see here we've got HSQC2, and it's giving us for each dimension, it's showing us where that peak is at the moment, where it would be if it's being made to overlay with this other peak, and then delta here is the difference, the amount by which the spectrum is going to be moved. So simply select whichever dimensions you want to move and then go to OK. And now the spectra overlay nicely. I'm just going to undo this and then show you one final method you can use to calibrate these spectra. And that is simply to right click on the background of your spectrum display and go to Calibrate Spectra. And that brings up this calibration panel. You can see we've got this bold mark here, and below we've got for each dimension, for X and for Y, we've got an original position, a new position, and then delta, and then these buttons here. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. In a moment you can see that these lines actually are two lines on top of each other. So you've got bold lines which specify this original position, and you've got these dotted lines which specify the new position. And you can either move these lines interactively, or you can specify the values here in these spin boxes. So I'm just going to zoom in on these two peaks here, and I'm going to specify that the original position of this blue spectrum is here, but really where I want it to be is this new position where it's exactly in the same place as this purple peak. Now if I were to click on apply, then this would change the referencing for all the spectra which are currently visible. Obviously I don't want to change the referencing for the purple spectrum, so I'm going to switch that off. Now I can change the referencing for this blue spectrum. Simply for each dimension click on apply. You'll notice the spectrum itself hasn't moved, it's actually the axes which are being moved here. And the same in the nitrogen dimension. finally, I can just close this and the spectrum display will return to normal. And obviously if I switch on my purple spectrum, these now overlay nicely. So as I mentioned before, it's entirely up to you which method of calibration you'd like to use. Some will prefer one, some another, and sometimes one might be more appropriate than at other times.